The fog was a gray wall. It had no beginning and no end. It swallowed the horizon, leaving only the hard-packed earth under Nora Bell's worn leather boots. The air was cold and damp, clinging to her skin like a second, colder layer of clothing. Each breath she took was a white ghost in front of her face, a brief proof of life before it dissolved into the nothingness of the morning. There was no sound but the crunch of her own footsteps and the faint, rhythmic clank of the cast-iron skillet she carried in her left hand. The sound was a small, lonely heartbeat in a silent world. Her hand, chapped and rough, was curled tight around the skillet's handle. The iron was heavy, a familiar and unforgiving weight. It was her only tool of value, the one thing that defined her purpose. In her other hand, she clutched the top of a burlap sack, its contents a lumpy weight against her hip. Barley. Not much, but enough to show she knew her trade, enough to prove she could make something from nearly nothing. She walked, one foot, then the next. The motion was automatic, a rhythm her body had known for days. The prairie stretched out around her, a flat, endless sea of brown grass sleeping under the gray blanket of fog. The wind was a low whisper, not strong enough to tear the mist apart, but persistent enough to find the gaps in her threadbare coat. It spoke of loneliness, of empty spaces, of how small one woman could be in a land so vast. A sharp pain flared in her right side, a hot poker twisting just beneath her ribs. She paused, her breath catching in her throat. She didn't press a hand to the spot. To acknowledge the pain was to give it power, and she had none to spare. It was a parting gift from the last ranch, from the foreman whose smile was as thin as a razor's edge. A lesson delivered by his boot when her cooking no longer pleased him, or perhaps when his temper, fueled by cheap whiskey, simply needed a target. The memory was a dull, ugly thing, without sharp edges anymore. It was just a fact, like the rising of the sun or the hardness of the ground. They had taken her wages, broken her ribs, and cast her out. She had not looked back. There was nothing to see. Her husband, Elias, had been dead for 2 years. The fever had taken him quickly, leaving her with little more than the skillet and a memory of hands that were strong and gentle. Sometimes, in the quiet of the trail, she would try to recall his face clearly, but it was like trying to hold smoke. The details blurred. What remained was a feeling, a sense of warmth, of safety. It was a fire that had long since burned down to embers, and she was afraid that one day there would be nothing left but cold ash. He had taught her to be strong, but he had never taught her how to be alone. This land did that. The fog began to thin as the sun, a pale, unseen disk, climbed higher in the sky. Patches of pale blue appeared, and the world slowly gained color and shape. The brown grass was tipped with silver from the dew. The earth beneath her feet was a deep, rich red, and the dust her boots kicked up was like fine rust. It settled on her skirt, on her coat, on the back of her hands. She was becoming part of the landscape, dyed by the very ground she crossed. With the sun came a new awareness. Thirst. Her throat was a dry knot. Her canteen had been empty since yesterday. The thought of water was a torment, a vision of a clear, cool stream that wasn't there. She pushed the thought away. Thirst was a distraction. Pain was a distraction. The only thing that mattered was the town. Dead trace. Even the name offered no comfort. It sounded like a place where things ended. For her, it had to be a place where something began. It had to be. She remembered hearing the name from a traveling merchant weeks ago. A hard town, he'd said, full of hard men, but there was always work for someone willing to cook. Men needed to eat, no matter how rough they were. That was the simple truth her life was built upon. A woman with a skillet and a bag of grain could find a place for a time. The trick was in the staying. The trick was in surviving the men you served. Her shadow grew long and thin behind her as the morning bled into afternoon. The sun was no longer a pale promise, but a hot, white weight in the sky. The heat baked the ground, and the air shimmered above the prairie. She pulled the brim of her bonnet lower, her eyes scanning the unchanging horizon. There was nothing, just the grass, the sky, and the silence. It was a silence that could drive a person mad if they listened too closely. It was full of whispers, the whispers of doubt, of fear, of the crushing weight of every mile she had walked and every mile she had yet to go. She thought of the last meal she had cooked at the foreman's ranch, a simple stew of rabbit and wild roots. He had eaten his fill, wiped his mouth, and then overturned the table. He had called her useless, a waste of space. The other hands had laughed. It was a hollow, cruel sound. She had learned long ago that a man's temper was as unpredictable as a prairie storm. It could gather on a clear day and break without warning. Her job was not just to cook, but to be invisible, to make herself so small and quiet that she offered no reason for the storm to break over her. But sometimes, it broke anyway. The pain in her side was a constant, dull throb now, a rhythm that matched her steps. She focused on the horizon, searching for a smudge of smoke, a dark line that was not a trick of the heat. For hours, there was nothing. Her hope, a fragile thing to begin with, began to fray at the edges. What if she had taken a wrong turn? What if the merchant had lied? What if Dead Trace was just a story? A phantom town in a land of emptiness. She stopped and shifted the weight of the sack. The barley felt heavier now, its promise of food a mockery when her body cried out for water. She licked her cracked lips, the taste of salt and dust. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sun beat down on her eyelids. In the darkness, she saw Elias's hands, whittling a piece of wood into a small bird for her. The memory was so clear, so sudden, that it felt like a punch to the gut. A tear, hot and sharp, escaped her eye and traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. She scrubbed it away angrily with the back of her hand. Tears were a luxury, like water. She had none to waste. She forced her eyes open and looked again. And there it was, so faint she thought she was imagining it, a dark, jagged line on the horizon. Not a hill, not a cloud. It was the uneven spine of rooftops, buildings. Dead Trace. A new strength, born of desperation and the first flicker of relief, flowed into her limbs. Her pace quickened. The skillet no longer felt so heavy. The pain in her ribs receded to a distant grumble. The town was real. It was there. It took another hour of hard walking for the smudge to resolve into definite shapes. Rough wooden buildings, leaning against each other as if for support. A main street, a river of red dust. No trees, no green. The town looked as if it had been carved from the raw, harsh land and left to bake in the sun. It was not a welcoming sight. It was a place of function, not comfort, a place to get a drink, buy supplies, and move on, or a place to die. As she drew closer, she could hear it, the distant ring of a blacksmith's hammer, the faint whinny of a horse, the low murmur of voices, too far to be distinct. These were the sounds of life. However rough, they were the sounds of a world that was not empty. She stopped at the edge of the town, just where the prairie grass gave way to the churned-up dust of the street. She took a deep breath, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke, horses, and something else, the faint, sour scent of spilled whiskey and unwashed bodies. She looked down at herself. Her dress was torn at the hem and stained with the red dust of her journey. Her hands were raw. Her face was a mask of exhaustion and dirt. She set the barley sack down for a moment, with a deliberate, steady hand. She straightened her bonnet. She tucked a loose strand of brown hair back into the tight bun at the nape of her neck. She brushed the worst of the dust from her coat. It was a small, futile gesture, but it was important. It was an act of defiance. She was not a beggar. She was not a drifter. She was Nora Bell. She was a cook, and she was here to work. She picked up the sack and the skillet. The iron was cool against her palm. She held it not like a weapon, but like a shield. Her knuckles were white. Her face was set, her eyes clear and direct, betraying none of the fear that churned in her stomach. She had walked out of the empty prairie, out of a past that had tried to break her. She was a woman made of silence and endurance, carrying her whole life in two hands, and with her head held high, she took her first step into the dusty street of Dead Trace. The first building that looked like it might offer work was a squat, two-story structure with a faded sign that read, "Ruse Boarding and Provisions." The paint was peeling, and one of the front windows was boarded over. It looked weary, as if the sun and wind had been beating it into submission for years. It was the kind of place that didn't ask questions, which was exactly what Nora needed. She pushed the door open. It groaned on its hinges, a sound of protest that made every head in the room turn. The interior was dark, smelling of stale beer, boiled cabbage, and damp wool. A dozen men were scattered at rough-hewn tables, their conversations dying in their throats. They stopped eating, stopped drinking, stopped talking. The only sound was the buzzing of a fat fly near a sticky spot on the bar. And then there were the eyes. They moved over her, slow and deliberate. They were not curious glances. They were assessments. They took in her worn dress, the dust on her shoulders, the exhaustion etched around her mouth. They lingered on the shape of her body beneath the coat, on the line of her throat. It was a familiar violation, a silent weighing and measuring. These were the eyes of men who saw a woman alone, not as a person, but as a possibility for comfort, for trouble, for use. Each stare was a thin blade, pressing against her skin without drawing blood. Nora kept her own eyes down. She focused on the floor, on the dark, damp wood, on a muddy boot print near the door. To meet their gaze would be an invitation, or a challenge. She could afford neither. She walked directly to the bar at the far end of the room, her footsteps unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. The skillet in her hand felt like an anchor, the one solid thing in a shifting, hostile sea. Behind the bar stood a woman. She was as weathered as the building itself, with a face like a dried apple and eyes the color of slate. Her hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin of her forehead. Her hands, resting on the scarred wood of the countertop, were thick-knuckled and capable. She watched Nora's approach without a flicker of expression. "Looking for something?" the woman said. It wasn't a question. Her voice was flat, like stones scraping together. Nora placed her burlap sack on the floor beside her feet. She did not set the skillet on the bar. She held it. "Work," Nora said, her own voice raspy from thirst. "I'm a cook." The woman's slate-gray eyes dropped to the skillet in Nora's hand, then to the sack of barley on the floor. It was a quick, appraising glance. "Can you cook for 20 men on a bad stove with half the provisions you need?" "I can cook for 30 with no stove if there's a fire," Nora replied. The words were simple, true. She had done it before. A man at a nearby table let out a low chuckle. The woman behind the bar shot him a look that silenced him instantly. She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial rasp that was meant only for Nora. "This is Dead Trace, girl. It ain't a place for soft hands or weak stomachs. The men are rough. They pay, but they expect more than just food for their coin." Nora understood the unspoken meaning. It hung in the air, thick and rancid as the smell of the room. She simply nodded, her face betraying nothing. "I cook, that's all." The woman studied her for a long, silent moment. She was looking for a crack, a fissure of fear or weakness she could exploit. Nora met her gaze squarely, her expression calm, her posture straight despite the fire in her side. She had nothing left to lose, and that gave her a strange, brittle kind of strength. Finally, the woman gave a short, sharp nod, as if coming to a decision. "I'm Gemma Rue. This place is mine. The cook I had got his hand broken in a card game last night and lit out before dawn. The kitchen's in the back. You'll get a cot in the storeroom. $1 a week and your keep. You start now. Supper has to be on the table in 3 hours." It was less a job offer and more a sentence. but it was a sentence that came with food and a roof. "Thank you, ma'am," Nora said. The words felt strange in her mouth. "Don't thank me yet," Gemma Rue said, her lips twisting into something that might have been a smile but held no warmth. She gestured with her chin toward the room of silent, watching men. "The work ain't the hard part." She leaned in closer, her voice barely a whisper. "A piece of advice. A woman alone out here is like a lame deer. Every predator for miles can smell you. Don't make a single mistake. Don't be too friendly. Don't be too proud. You be invisible. You understand me, invisible." Nora nodded again. A tight, single movement. "I understand." "Good." Gemma straightened up, her voice returning to its normal, harsh volume. "Kitchen's through there. Don't use too much firewood." Nora picked up her sack and turned. The eyes followed her as she walked the length of the room toward a door behind the bar. The silence held until she was through it, and only then did the low murmur of conversation resume, like a river flowing back into its bed after a stone has been dropped. The kitchen was small and dark. A single grimy window looked out onto a muddy alley. The air was thick with the smell of old grease and stale bread. A massive, cast-iron stove stood cold against one wall, its surface stained and rusted. A long wooden table, its surface gouged and scarred by countless knives, dominated the center of the room. There were a few dented pots hanging from hooks, a stack of chipped plates, and not much else. It was a grim, forgotten space, but to Nora, it was a sanctuary. Here, at least, she had a purpose. Here, the rules were simple: fire, water, flour, meat. She set her sack of barley on the table. She ran a hand over the rough wood, feeling the grain beneath her palm. Then, with a quiet reverence, she hung her own skillet on an empty hook. It looked new and dark and whole next to the other battered cookware. It was a piece of her past, hanging on the wall of her new life. She found the water pump in the alley, the iron handle cold and stiff. The water that came out was rusty at first, but then it ran clear and cold. She drank deeply, letting the water soothe her raw throat. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. She splashed her face, washing away the layers of dust, the journey falling away from her in muddy trickles. Back in the kitchen, she began her work. Her movements were efficient, born of years of practice. She found the wood pile, her breath catching at the stab of pain in her ribs as she bent to pick up the logs. She ignored it. She laid the fire in the stove, her hands moving with a sureness that belied her exhaustion. She found a sack of potatoes and a slab of salt pork in the pantry. It wasn't much, but it would be enough. As she worked, peeling the potatoes with a small, sharp knife, she could hear the sounds from the common room, the deep rumble of men's voices, the sudden, sharp bark of laughter, the clink of glasses. Each sound was a reminder of what lay on the other side of the door. She was in a cage with hungry animals, and her job was to feed them. The pain in her side was a low, constant fire. Her hands ached, her feet were swollen in her boots. But as the fire in the stove caught and began to roar, as the smell of wood smoke and cooking food began to fill the small kitchen, a sliver of something like peace settled over her. This, she understood. The weight of a knife, the heat of a stove, the transformation of simple ingredients into a meal. This was a language she knew. An hour later, Gemma Rue entered the kitchen without a sound. She stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, watching Nora stir the large pot of stew. The room was warm now, filled with the savory smell of pork and onions. "Smells like food," Gemma stated, her tone grudgingly approving. Nora didn't turn around. "It will be ready on time." Gemma walked over to the table and picked up a stray potato peeling. She examined it as if it were a precious gem. "You don't waste much. Waste is a sin my mother taught me to avoid," Nora said quietly. "Your mother ain't here," Gemma said, dropping the peeling. "Out here, waste ain't a sin. It's a death sentence." She paused, and Nora could feel the woman's eyes on her back. "I saw the way you walked in. You've been hurt." Nora's hand tightened on the wooden spoon. She kept stirring the stew, her eyes fixed on the bubbling contents of the pot. "The trail is hard." "It ain't the trail that breaks a woman's ribs," Gemma said, her voice low and sharp. "It's men." She was quiet for a moment. "I've seen dozens like you pass through here. Some are running from something. Some are running to something. Most are just running. They don't last long. They get broken, or they get foolish. They think a soft word from a man means something. They think a smile is a promise. It ain't. It's just a way of baring teeth before the bite." Nora finally turned, her face calm. "I'm not looking for promises, Mrs. Rue. I'm looking to earn my keep." Gemma's hard eyes searched Nora's face. "See that you remember that," she said. Then she turned and left as silently as she had come. Nora was alone again with the sound of the bubbling stew and the crackling fire. The warning had been clear. Colder and sharper than any prairie wind. Dead Trace was a proving ground. Here, survival was a deliberate act, a series of calculated choices made every minute of every day. Her role was clear. She was the cook. A function, a pair of hands. She was to be a ghost in this house, nourishing the living while remaining unseen. To be anything more was to invite disaster. She knew this. She had learned it the hard way, in a language written in bruises and pain. Cook. Be silent. Survive. She picked up another potato and began to peel. The midday meal was an exercise in organized chaos. Nora moved through it like a ghost, just as Gemma Rue had instructed. The common room, which had been tense and quiet upon her arrival, was now loud with the business of eating. Men hunched over their bowls, shoveling stew into their mouths with a grim determination. The sounds were coarse, the scrape of metal spoons against ceramic, loud slurps, the thud of a heavy mug on a wooden table. The air was thick with the steam from the stew, the scent of sweat, and the low, rumbling drone of a dozen separate conversations. Nora's world was a circuit. From the heat and steam of the kitchen, she would emerge with a heavy tray of bread or another pot of stew. She'd move between the tables, her eyes focused on the task at hand, refilling a bowl, clearing an empty plate. She kept her gaze low, her expression neutral. She learned to anticipate a man's needs before he had to ask, to see an empty cup from the corner of her eye. Invisibility was a skill, and she was a fast learner. She was a pair of hands, a function, a silent presence that made food appear. The men, for their part, seemed to have accepted this. They no longer stared. They grunted their thanks or simply nodded, their attention already back on their food. She was becoming part of the room's worn furniture. She was on her way back to the kitchen, an empty pot in her hands, when it happened. It wasn't a loud noise that caused it. It was the opposite. It was a cessation of noise. A single conversation near the front window faltered and died. Then another. It was a ripple of silence that spread outwards from the front of the room, consuming the clatter and the chatter until the only sound left was the buzz of that same fat fly from the morning. Forks stopped midway to mouths. Laughter died in throats. Men who had been leaning back in their chairs slowly, deliberately straightened up, their shoulders, which had been slumped with the comfortable fatigue of a full belly, now seemed to squared. It was not a sudden, fearful movement. It was a slow, cautious realignment, the way a herd of deer will lift their heads at the scent of a predator on the wind. Nora froze in the middle of the room. The empty pot suddenly felt heavy in her hands. The shift in the atmosphere was a physical thing, a drop in temperature, a thickening of the air. Her own breath felt loud in her chest. She looked toward the bar. Gemma Rue, who had been wiping a mug with a dirty rag, had stopped. Her hands were still, her head cocked slightly toward the street, her hard eyes fixed on the front window. Her posture was rigid, watchful. Then came a sound from outside, filtering through the walls of the saloon. It was the sound of a horse, but it was unlike the quick, nervous clatter of the other animals tied to the hitching post. This was a slow, Heavy, deliberate tread. Each hoofbeat was a deep, resonant thud against the hard-packed earth. It was the sound of immense weight, moving without hurry, without concern. It was the sound of power. Every eye in the room was now on the front window or the door. Yet no one seemed to truly want to look. They glanced, then quickly looked away, as if a direct stare was a provocation. A man near Nora, a big trapper with a beard that covered half his chest, slowly placed his spoon into his half-empty bowl, making no sound. He folded his hands on the table, his knuckles white. Nora, caught in the gravitational pull of the room's tension, found her eyes drawn to the grimy front window. The light outside shifted. A shadow fell across the street, impossibly large. The hoofbeats grew louder, closer. Thud, thud, thud. They were right outside now. They did not stop. They did not slow. Through the distorted glass, she saw him. He was mounted on a horse so large it looked more like a creature of myth than of flesh and blood. A great, black beast with a chest like a barrel and hooves the size of dinner plates. But the horse was dwarfed by the man who rode it. He was a giant. His shoulders were a solid, straight line that seemed to stretch the fabric of his dark coat to its limit. Even sitting, his size was overwhelming. He wore a low-brimmed hat that shadowed his face, but she could see a square jaw and a profile that looked as if it had been carved from rock. His hands, resting on the pommel of his saddle, were huge, one lightly holding the thick leather reins. He did not look at the boarding house. He did not seem to notice the town at all. His gaze was fixed straight ahead, down the dusty track of the main street. He moved through dead trace like a river moves through a canyon, an elemental force that acknowledges no obstacle. He was simply passing through. The hoofbeats began to fade, their rhythm as steady and relentless in their departure as they had been in their arrival. Thud, 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 and then they were gone. For a long moment, the room remained suspended in silence. It was as if no one dared to be the first to move, the first to speak. Then, someone coughed, a small, nervous sound. The trapper beside Nora slowly unfolded his hands and picked up his spoon. Someone else scraped their chair against the floor. A low murmur started near the back, and like the silence before it, it spread, until the room was once again filled with the drone of conversation. But it was different. The noise was more subdued, the laughter less boisterous. The energy that had been in the room before was gone, replaced by a lingering residue of caution, of respect that was almost fear. Nora let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. She forced her feet to move, completing her journey to the kitchen. She set the pot down with a clatter that sounded loud even to her own ears. She leaned against the doorframe, looking back into the common room. Now that the presence had passed, the men were talking about him. Their voices were low, their heads bent together over their tables. She couldn't hear full sentences, only fragments, whispers that drifted into the kitchen on the stale air. "Rourke," one man muttered, shaking his head. "White Ridge, place is a fortress, came from another table." A young cowhand, his face still pale, spoke to an older man beside him. Never seen him this close before. "He's bigger than the stories." The older man grunted. "And the stories don't tell half of it. You keep your head down and your mouth shut when Grant Rourke rides by. That's the first and last rule of Dead Trace." Nora pushed away from the door and began to busy herself, collecting dirty plates, her mind racing. Grant Rourke. The name meant nothing to her, but it clearly meant everything here. He was the reason for the sudden silence, the shared tension. He was the predator the whole herd had sensed. Later, as she was washing the last of the pots, Gemma Rue came into the kitchen. She started stacking the clean plates without a word, her movements brisk and efficient. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken questions. Nora finally broke it, her voice quiet. "Who was that?" Gemma didn't look up from her work. That was Grant Rourke. She said the name as if it were a fact, like naming a mountain or a river. "The men," Nora began, then trailed off, unsure how to phrase it. "The men have sense," Gemma finished for her, her voice flat. "Some of them. Anyway, Rourke owns the White Ridge Ranch, miles north of here, up against the mountains. Keeps to himself mostly. Comes into town for supplies maybe 4 times a year. Never says more than 10 words. Just gets what he needs and leaves." Gemma stopped stacking and finally looked at Nora, her slate-gray eyes direct and serious. "Listen to me. There are 2 kinds of people who have dealings with Grant Rourke, the ones he helps and the ones he puts in the ground. There's no in-between with him. If you're starving and he thinks you're worth a damn, he'll give you the coat off his back and a winter's worth of food. He's done it. But if you cross him, if you steal from him, or lie to him, or hurt someone he's decided to protect," she paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "Well, people who cross Grant Rourke just disappear. The Coulter brothers found that out last spring. Tried to rustle some of his cattle. No one's seen or heard from them since." Gemma picked up the last plate. "He's not law, and he's not an outlaw. He's just Rourke, a force of nature. You stay out of his way. You don't draw his notice. He is the biggest mistake you can make in this town." With that, she turned and left the kitchen, leaving Nora alone with the cooling stove and the lingering scent of stew. Nora dried her hands on her apron, her mind trying to piece together the image of the man on the horse with the reputation Gemma had just described. A man who was both a savior and an executioner. A silent giant who cast a shadow over the entire town without ever setting foot in its buildings. She looked at her own hands, chapped and red from the hot water. She thought of the men in the common room, their sudden stillness, their hushed whispers. She had come to Dead Trace looking for a place to be invisible, a place to survive. She was beginning to understand that in this town. Survival wasn't just about avoiding the loud, obvious dangers. It was also about understanding the quiet, powerful ones, the silent giants who rode through the streets and changed the very air you breathed. And she, a woman with nothing but a skillet and a past full of pain, was a fragile thing caught in the middle of it all. The pain in her side flared, a sharp reminder of her own vulnerability in this hard, unforgiving land. The days at Gemma Rue's boarding house fell into a rhythm, as hard and unvarying as a heartbeat. Nora's life was circumscribed by the 4 walls of the kitchen. She rose before the sun, the floorboards cold beneath her bare feet. The first task was always the fire, coaxing life back into the iron stove. Then came the coffee, grinding the beans by hand, the rough scrape and the rich, dark smell filling the pre-dawn quiet. Biscuits were next, her hands working the dough with an economy of motion, her mind still half asleep. By the time the first boarders stumbled into the common room, their faces puffy with sleep, the coffee was boiling and the smell of baking bread was a promise against the morning chill. She served the breakfast rush in a state of focused invisibility, a moving part in a machine she was beginning to understand. The men were less guarded in the mornings, their talk revolving around horses, cattle prices, and the weather. They mostly ignored her, which was a blessing. The midday meal was the biggest, the loudest, the most demanding. After that, a brief lull, a precious hour or 2 where she could clean, prep for supper, and catch her breath. The pain in her side had subsided to a dull, persistent ache, a bodily memory she was learning to live with. Supper was a quieter affair, and by the time she had scoured the last pot and banked the fire for the night, her body screamed with an exhaustion so deep it felt like it had settled in her bones. She would retreat to her cot in the storeroom, the smells of flour and smoked bacon clinging to her clothes, and fall into a dreamless sleep that was less rest and more a temporary death. She was surviving. The $1 Gemma paid her each week was tucked away in a small cloth bag. It was a pitifully small sum, but it was hers. It was proof that she could stand on her own. It was on a Tuesday, 2 weeks into her employment, that they came. There were 2 of them. They didn't sit at a table like the others. They leaned against the bar. Nursing 2 glasses of whiskey they didn't seem to be drinking. They were different from the usual prospectors and ranch hands. They were leaner, harder. Their clothes were thick with the kind of trail dust that doesn't come from a day's ride, but from weeks on the move. Their eyes were constantly moving, taking in the room, the men, and, most especially, her. Nora felt their stares as she moved from the kitchen to the tables. It was not the usual, predatory gaze she had become accustomed to. This was different. It was analytical, a cold and patient assessment. She kept her head down, her focus on her work, but the feeling of being watched was a physical weight on her shoulders. When the midday rush was over and the common room had emptied out, they were still there. Gemma Rue stood behind the bar, polishing glasses, her back to them but every line of her body radiating a tense awareness. Nora was wiping down the last table when the taller of the 2 men pushed himself off the bar and walked toward her. He moved with a quiet, confident stride. He was handsome in a rough, weathered way, with a thin smile that didn't reach his pale blue eyes. He stopped a few feet from her, hooking his thumbs in his belt. "You're the new cook," he said. His voice was smooth, almost gentle. Nora stopped wiping the table. She kept her eyes on the rag in her hand. "I am—" "We've heard good things, simple food, but clean and honest." She didn't reply. Compliments from men like him were never just compliments. They were keys, used to unlock a door you didn't want opened. "My name is Jed Collar," he said. "My outfit is driving a herd north. We need a cook, a good one. We're tired of our own miserable attempts." The name Collar was a faint echo in her mind, a half-remembered whisper, but she couldn't place it. She risked a quick glance at Gemma. The older woman's face was a stone mask, but her eyes sent a clear, sharp warning. "I have a job," Nora said, her voice steady. "You have a job scrubbing floors and serving stew for $1 a week," Jed Collar said, his smile widening slightly. The smile made him look like a wolf. "I'm offering you $5 a week, and you'll be treated with respect. You cook for my men, and no one bothers you. That's the rule." $5. The amount was staggering. It was more money than she had seen in a year. It was the kind of money that could buy a future, a small piece of land, a life where she wasn't at the mercy of others. It was a ticket out. The temptation was a physical thing, a hot, sharp pull in her gut. "What's the catch?" she asked, her voice low. Jed Collar chuckled. "No catch, just a long, hard drive. The work is tough, but the pay is good. We break camp in the morning. The offer is for now." She looked around the dingy, dark common room. She thought of her lumpy cot in the storeroom, of the endless cycle of pots and pans, of the low-level fear that was a constant companion. Gemma was fair in her own harsh way, but this was a dead end. This was survival, not life. The $5 wasn't just money. It was a chance. It was a risk, a terrible risk. But what wasn't? "All right," she said, the word coming out before she had fully considered it. Jed Collar's smile finally reached his eyes. "Good. Be ready at dawn. My man, Silas, will come for you." He nodded once, then turned and walked out, his silent companion following a step behind. Nora stood frozen for a long moment. She had just sold herself to a man with the eyes of a wolf for a handful of silver. She turned to face Gemma. The older woman had not moved. She slowly, deliberately, put down the glass she was polishing. "Do you know who that was?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. He said his name was Collar. "The Coulter brothers who disappeared last spring, the ones who crossed Grant Rourke." Gemma's eyes were like chips of ice. "That was their cousin. He's been gathering the worst sort of men for months, building a new outfit. They say he's looking to prove something, that he's looking for revenge." The pieces clicked into place. The name, the cold assessment, the warning in Gemma's eyes. Nora's blood ran cold. She had just hired on with the sworn enemies of the one man in the territory you did not cross. $5 a week is a high price for a cook," Gemma said. her voice laced with a grim finality. "It's what a man pays for a soldier, or a spy. You've made a mistake, girl, a bad one." She shook her head slowly. "You're trading a mean dog, you know, for a pack of wolves you don't—" There was nothing Nora could say. The deal was done. That night, she lay on her cot, the sounds of the boarding house a distant murmur. She clutched the small bag with her $2 in it. It felt pathetic, useless. She had traded her fragile safety for a promise, and she was already sure it was a lie. Silas came for her before the sun was up. He was the other man from the bar, big and silent, with a face that looked like it had been used to stop a thrown rock. He didn't speak, just grunted and loaded her small bag and her skillet onto a pack horse. She followed him out of town on foot, not looking back. The collar camp was a few miles out, a chaotic circle of bedrolls, supply wagons, and a large rope corral holding a few dozen horses. The main herd, a sea of brown hides and horns, was grazing in the distance, their lowing a constant, deep hum. About 15 men were gathered around a crackling fire, drinking coffee. They stopped talking when she approached, their eyes following her. They were a hard-looking crew, their faces unshaven, their gear worn and dusty. Jed Collar greeted her with his thin smile. "Welcome to your new kitchen, Miss Bell." He gestured to a chuck wagon and the open fire. "Everything you need should be in there. We ride in an hour." The days that followed were the hardest of Nora's life. The work was relentless, brutal. She was up hours before the men, grinding coffee in the bitter cold, her fingers numb. She made breakfast over the open fire, the smoke stinging her eyes, the heat scorching her face. She would pack up the wagon, clean the mess, and then ride for hours. The wagon jolting over the rough terrain, the pain in her side a constant, angry companion. The noon meal was a frantic rush to get a fire going and food cooked while the men rested the herd. Then it was back on the trail until dusk. Supper was cooked in the gathering dark, and she would clean the pots by firelight, her body a single, unified ache. She would collapse into her bedroll, set a little ways off from the men, and sleep like the dead for a few short hours before it started all over again. For the first week, she worked in a bubble of silence. The men kept their distance, they took their food, ate, and returned their plates with a grunt or a nod. They treated her with a careful, almost artificial respect, just as Jed had promised. But she could feel their eyes on her, always watching. The whispers started in the second week. They were quiet at first, like the rustle of snakes in dry grass. She would be gathering firewood at the edge of the camp and hear a low murmur from the main fire. A murmur that would stop the moment she turned around. She would be kneading dough on the chuck wagon's tailgate, and 2 men talking nearby would fall silent, their eyes flicking toward her before they ambled away. The poison seeped in slowly. The atmosphere of the camp began to change. The professional distance of the men curdled into something else. Suspicion. Their looks were no longer just watchful. They were hostile. They started talking about Grant Rourke. They never spoke to her about him, but they spoke loudly enough for her to hear. They told stories of his ruthlessness, of the men he had ruined, of the Coulter boys. "Just vanished, like the ground swallowed him up," one of them would say, staring into the fire but directing the words into the darkness where she sat. "Rourke's got eyes everywhere," another would add. "Heard he pays well for information." One evening, Jed Collar ambled over to where she was washing a large pot. He squatted down by the fire, poking it with a stick. "You're a quiet woman." "Nora," he said, his voice casual. "Where you from originally?" "East," she said, not looking at him. "East is a big place. Ever spend any time up north near the White Ridge Mountains?" Her hands stilled in the greasy water. "No." He looked up at her, his pale eyes catching the firelight. "That's a shame. Beautiful country, they say. My cousins were fond of it. The Coulter boys. Maybe you heard of them." "I keep to myself," she said, her voice tight. "Of course you do," he said, his voice as smooth as oil. "That's a valuable skill in a woman, to be able to be somewhere, but not really be seen. A person like that, a quiet woman, a cook, say, she could go places, hear things. No one would pay her any mind. A man like Grant Rourke, a man who likes to know things. He would find a person like that very useful. He stood up, brushing the dust from his pants. He wasn't smiling anymore. His face was cold, hard. A man like that would pay very well, maybe even $5 a week. He walked away, leaving her kneeling by the fire. The threat was no longer a whisper. It was a cold, hard fact. They hadn't hired a cook. They had hired a suspect. They had brought her out here, miles from anywhere, to this circle of hostile men, because they believed she was a spy for the man they hated most. The $5 a week wasn't a wage. It was a trap, and she had walked right into it. The water in the pot had gone cold, and for the first time since she'd arrived in Dead Trace, Nora Bell was truly, terrifyingly afraid. The air in the camp had turned sour. For 3 days after Jed Collar's veiled accusation, a thick, ugly silence followed Nora everywhere she went. The men no longer spoke to her, not even to grunt their thanks. They would take their plates of food from her hands without meeting her eyes, and their conversations, always held just out of earshot, would stop the moment she drew near. They watched her constantly, their gazes heavy with a simmering resentment. She was a foreign object in their midst, a splinter they were desperate to remove. She cooked, she cleaned, she packed the wagon. She did her work with a frantic, quiet efficiency, hoping that her usefulness would be a shield, but she knew it was not enough. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach that never went away. At night, she would lie in her bedroll, her hand resting on the cool iron of her skillet, and listen to the sounds of the camp, the lowing of the cattle, the crackle of the fire, the quiet murmur of the men on watch. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the grass, sent a jolt of terror through her. She was a prisoner, miles from any law or kindness, surrounded by her captors. The breaking point came on a moonless night. The outfit had spent the day driving the herd through a rocky, difficult pass, and the men's tempers were frayed. That evening, Jed Collar produced 2 large jugs of whiskey. It was not for celebration. It was fuel. As the liquor flowed, the men's resentment, which had been simmering for days, began to boil over. Their voices grew louder, their laughter harsher. Their talk, as it always did, turned to Grant Rourke. They spoke of him with a mixture of hatred and fear, their words slurring together in a litany of curses. And from Rourke, the conversation inevitably turned to her. Nora stayed by the chuck wagon, her back to the fire, scrubbing a pot with a furious energy. She tried to make herself small, to fade into the shadows, but the firelight cast her silhouette against the canvas, making her a target. "Look at her," one of the men slurred, his voice carrying across the campsite, working away like she's got something to prove. "Or something to hide," another added, and a round of coarse laughter followed. She kept scrubbing, her knuckles white. Don't react, don't look up, be invisible. But the whiskey had made them brave. Jed Collar rose from his place by the fire and walked toward her, the jug of whiskey swinging in his hand. He moved with an unsteady swagger, but his eyes were sharp, cold points of light in the darkness. He stopped in front of her, blocking her from the fire. "Take a drink. Cook," he said, his voice dangerously soft. He held out the jug. Nora shook her head, her eyes fixed on the pot in her hands. "I don't drink, sir." "Too good for our whiskey," he pressed. "Or is it that Rourke's spies ain't allowed to drink with the men they're spying on?" The accusation hung in the air, naked and sharp. This was it, the moment she had been dreading. The men by the fire had gone quiet, their faces turned toward her, their expressions a mixture of drunken curiosity and malice. "I don't know, Mr. Rourke," she said, her voice a thin thread in the sudden silence. "I'm just a cook." Jed laughed, a short, ugly sound. A cook. He took a long swallow from the jug, then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "My cousins thought they were just taking a few head of cattle. An honest day's thieving. But Rourke's justice is something else entirely. He needs his spies. He needs his little birds to tell him who's coming and going. He leaned closer, his breath hot and sour with whiskey. And you, Nora Bell, you flew straight into our camp. Before she could react, he kicked the pot out of her hands. It flew through the air and landed with a loud clang. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons, and hauled her to her feet. He dragged her toward the fire, into the circle of watching men. "Let's see what Rourke's little bird has to say when we start plucking her feathers," he snarled. He shoved her hard. She stumbled and fell to her knees in the dirt. The ground was hard and cold. She looked up at the circle of faces looming over her. In the flickering firelight, they were no longer men. They were distorted masks of hatred, their eyes glittering, their mouths twisted into cruel sneers. The violence that followed was a chaotic storm of pain. It was not a fight. It was a punishment. A heavy boot caught her in the side, right where she had been hurt before. A bloom of white-hot agony exploded in her ribs, stealing her breath. She gasped, curling into a ball as another kick landed on her back. She tasted dust and blood. Their jeers and laughter were a meaningless roar in her ears. The world splintered into fragments of light and shadow, of sharp, searing pain and moments of dull, floating numbness. Through the haze of pain, she heard Jed's voice, clear and cold. "Get her skillet." A new kind of terror, sharper and colder than the fear for her own life, pierced through her. No, not that, anything but that. It was the last piece of Elias, the last piece of her old life. It was the only thing of value she had. One of the men fetched it from the wagon and threw it into the center of the circle. It landed in the dirt with a soft thud. It looked small and dark and vulnerable. "A woman's weapon," Jed sneered. "Let's see how it holds up." He picked up a heavy rock from the fire pit. He lifted it high. Nora tried to scream, to plead, but the only sound that came out was a dry, ragged gasp. The rock came down. The sound was not the loud clang of metal on metal she expected. It was a sharp, final crack, a sound of breaking, a sound of death. She saw the skillet lying in two pieces, a jagged line running through its center, and in that moment, something inside her broke with it. The kicking stopped. The men's drunken fury seemed to have been spent on the destruction of the simple iron pan. They were laughing, panting, congratulating each other. She was forgotten, a broken thing lying in the dirt next to another broken thing. Two of them grabbed her by the arms and dragged her away from the fire. The rough ground scraped against her back. They dragged her to the edge of the camp, to the very edge of the firelight, and threw her into the darkness. She landed in a heap, her body a symphony of pain. She heard them walking away, their laughter fading as they returned to the warmth and the light of the fire. And then there was only silence. She lay in the cold, damp grass, adrift in a sea of agony. Every breath was a fresh torment, a knife twisting in her side. The world was a blur of darkness and indifferent stars. She thought this must be what it felt like to die. The cold seeped into her bones, a deep, final chill. Consciousness became a frayed rope, and she let go, drifting into a black, silent void. Time ceased to have meaning. There was only the cold, the pain, and the darkness. But then, much later, through the fog of unconsciousness, she became aware of something new. It was not a sound. Not at first. It was a feeling, a deep, rhythmic vibration in the earth beneath her, a pulse that she felt in her broken ribs. Thud! 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 The vibration grew stronger, resolving itself into a sound, the slow, heavy, deliberate tread of a massive horse. The sound was a memory, a ghost from a sunlit afternoon in Dead Trace. It grew louder, closer, until it stopped, somewhere nearby in the darkness. Silence. The silence was absolute, heavier and more profound than the one that had come before. Then, the creak of saddle leather, the soft thud of heavy boots on the ground. A shape blotted out the stars above her, a figure so large it seemed to consume the pre-dawn light. It moved without a sound, a mountain of shadow that knelt beside her. She could not make out a face, only a vast, dark presence. She felt a hand, surprisingly gentle, touch her forehead, brushing away a strand of hair matted with dirt and blood. The hand was huge, warm, and its touch was so unexpected, so impossibly kind, that it felt like a brand. She flinched, a small, involuntary movement. The figure was still for a long moment. She could feel his gaze on her, though she could not see his eyes. He looked from her to the broken pieces of her skillet, glinting faintly in the first gray light of dawn. Then he looked back at her. He did not speak. There were no words of comfort, no questions. There was only action. He slid one massive arm beneath her shoulders and the other under her knees. And then he lifted her. The movement was effortless, as smooth and certain as the rising of the sun. She felt a moment of weightlessness, a dizzying sense of disbelief. After the brutality, the dragging, the feeling of being discarded like trash, this simple, gentle act of being lifted was a shock that went deeper than any of the blows. He held her as if she weighed nothing at all. He held her as if she were a child. He carried her away from the sleeping, drunken camp. He carried her away from the pieces of her broken past. He walked toward the eastern horizon, where a thin line of pale light was beginning to silhouette the distant mountains. And for the first time in a very, very long time, Nora Bell was not alone. The world returned to Nora in broken pieces. At first, there was only the rhythmic sway, a gentle rocking motion that seemed to go on for an eternity. She was floating in a dark, warm sea, the pain a distant, muffled drumbeat. Occasionally, a sliver of light would pierce the darkness, the sharp, blue edge of the sky, the blur of gray-green sagebrush, the immense, sun-bleached face of a stone cliff. There was a constant, solid warmth against her back and a steady, powerful heartbeat that was not her own. She was being carried, and for the first time in her memory, being carried did not mean being dragged. Consciousness came and went like the tide. She remembered the hard line of a shoulder beneath her cheek and the scent of leather, dust, and pine. She remembered the sun, warm on her face, and the low nicker of a horse. Then, darkness again. When she woke properly, the rocking had stopped. She was on her back, staring up at a ceiling made of thick, rough-hewn timber beams. The light was soft, filtered through a single, clean window. A fire crackled in a stone hearth to her left, its warmth a gentle weight upon her. She was lying in a bed, a real bed with a thick mattress and a heavy wool blanket pulled up to her chin. The sheets smelled of soap and sun. She tried to sit up, but a bolt of agony shot through her ribs, and she fell back with a gasp, her vision swimming. The pain was no longer a distant drum. It was a sharp, jagged reality. Her body was a map of torment. She lay still, breathing in shallow, careful gulps, waiting for the world to stop spinning. She was not in the collar camp. She was not in Gemma Rue's musty storeroom. This place was quiet. The silence was profound, broken only by the snap and hiss of the fire. It was a clean silence, not the tense, watchful quiet of the boarding house or the resentful, simmering quiet of the trail. It was the silence of a house that was at peace with the wilderness around it. A shadow fell over her. She flinched, her body tensing, her heart seizing with a familiar terror. She turned her head, her muscles screaming in protest. Grant Rourke stood beside the bed. He was even larger indoors, a mountain of a man who seemed to fill the small, simple room. His face was in shadow, his expression unreadable. He held a ceramic cup in one of his massive hands. He did not speak. He simply knelt beside the bed, a gesture that seemed incongruous with his size, and held the cup to her lips. Her first instinct was to recoil, but there was no threat in his posture, no malice in his presence. There was only a quiet, steady purpose. She was weak, and she was thirsty. She parted her cracked lips, and he tilted the cup, letting a trickle of cool, clean water slide into her mouth. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. He let her drink in slow, careful sips until she turned her head away. He set the cup on the small table beside the bed and, without a word, he rose and left the room, closing the door softly behind him. The first days were a blur of such moments. Nora drifted in a fog of pain and exhaustion, her world shrinking to the confines of the bed and the four walls of the room. Her life was measured by his silent actions. She would wake to find the fire built up, a fresh log smoldering on the grate. A bowl of thin, savory broth would be on the table, always warm, as if he knew the exact moment she would be able to stomach it. The water pitcher was never empty. He would enter the room 2 or 3 times a day. He moved with a quiet grace that belied his bulk. He would check her bandages. His hands, which could have snapped a man's neck, were impossibly gentle as he cleaned and redressed her wounds. He would spoon a bitter, herbal medicine into her mouth that dulled the pain and pulled her back into the heavy, healing dark of sleep. He never spoke, not once. He did not ask her what had happened. He did not tell her where she was. He did not offer words of pity or comfort. His comfort was in the warmth of the fire, the coolness of the water, the simple, undeniable fact that she was being cared for. On the 4th day, the fog in her mind began to clear. She woke to the pale gold of late afternoon light slanting through the window. The pain in her side was a deep, sullen ache, but it was bearable. She pushed herself up slowly, gritting her teeth, and managed to sit with her back against the headboard. The room swam for a moment, then settled. She looked around, truly seeing the place for the first time. The room was sparse but solid. The bed was made of thick, dark wood. The floor was wide planks, scrubbed clean. There was a single sturdy chair by the fire and a small chest at the foot of the bed. It was a man's room, built for function, not for decoration, but it was also a place of safety. The stone walls were thick, the heavy door a barrier against the world that had tried to destroy her. Through the window, she could see a slice of a vast, empty valley and the sheer, white-streaked face of a massive cliff that rose into the piercing blue sky. White Ridge. She was alone. The house was silent. She could hear the wind whispering around the corners of the building. A low, lonely sound. She felt a pang of fear. What did he want from her? No one, in her experience, offered kindness without a price. Gemma Rue wanted labor. Jed Collar wanted a scapegoat. What did this silent giant want? Her eyes fell upon the hearth, and then she saw it, propped against the stones, where the warmth of the fire could touch it, was her skillet. It was in 2 pieces. He had brought the broken halves with him. The sight of it sent a wave of despair through her, a grief so sharp it was like a fresh wound. It was the tangible proof of her failure, of her utter and complete breaking. He had placed it there, she thought, as a reminder of what she was, a ruined thing. She closed her eyes, and tears, hot and bitter, slid down her cheeks. She did not make a sound. The next morning, she was woken by a sound. It was faint, rhythmic, ping, ping, ping. It was the sound of a hammer striking metal. It came from somewhere outside, a small, clear sound in the vast silence of the valley. It continued all day, a distant, steady percussion that became the new rhythm of her life. She would lie in bed and listen, wondering. Ping, ping, ping. It was a sound of purpose, of creation. It was the sound of something being made. Or perhaps, she thought, something being mended. For 2 days, the sound was her constant companion. In that time, she grew stronger. She was able to get out of bed and walk, stiffly and painfully, to the chair by the fire. She would sit for hours, wrapped in a blanket, watching the flames and listening to the distant, musical ring of the hammer. His routine did not change. He would leave food for her on the table and retreat, giving her the gift of his absence, the space to heal in private. She had not seen him in 2 days, but she knew he was there. He was the fire in the hearth, the food on the table, the steady, ringing hammer in the distance. On the 3rd morning, she woke to silence. The hammering had stopped. The quiet that settled over the house felt different, heavier, as if holding its breath. She rose and made her way to the chair. The fire was lit. The morning broth was on the table, but on the hearth, placed in the center of the stone where she could not miss it, was her skillet. It was whole. She stared, her heart seeming to stop in her chest. She pushed herself out of the chair and knelt slowly, painfully, on the hearth rug. She reached out a trembling hand and touched it. The iron was still faintly warm. It was not new. It was not perfect. A thin, silvery line, brighter than the dark, seasoned iron around it, ran down its center. It was a scar, a seam where he had heated the metal to a glowing cherry red and hammered the 2 broken pieces back into one. He had reforged it. He had taken what was destroyed and made it whole again. It was dented and scarred, but it was strong. It was hers. She traced the scar with her fingertip. It was a raised, rough line, a testament to the violence that had broken it and the patient strength that had healed it. He had not thrown it away and given her a new one. He had taken the time, with his own massive hands, to repair what was hers, to restore her tool, to restore her. She lowered her head until her forehead rested on the mended iron, and she wept. The tears were not for the pain or the fear. They were for this single, silent act of profound and unconditional kindness. It was an act that said, without words, that he saw her not as a victim, not as a woman to be pitied, but as a person with a trade, a person whose tools were worthy of respect. He was treating her as an equal. She stayed there for a long time, her hands resting on her skillet, the warmth of the hearthstone seeping into her. When she finally looked up, the light in the room had changed. The sun was higher in the sky, and the room was filled with a clear, bright light. She felt as though something had been mended inside of her, as well. A small, jagged piece of her own broken hope had been forged back into place. She did not know what the future held. She did not know why he had saved her or what he would expect of her now. But as she looked at the healed iron skillet, scarred but strong, she knew one thing. In this silent house, under the shadow of the great white cliff, she was, for the first time, safe. And she understood that respect, the truest kind, was not something that was spoken. It was something that was built, slowly and patiently, with fire and a hammer and 2 strong, gentle hands. A month passed. The first snows of winter dusted the high peaks of the mountains that cradled White Ridge, a stark, white crown against a steel-gray sky. The rhythm of life in the silent valley was slow and predictable, governed by the sun and the needs of the land. Nora healed. The deep, vicious bruises faded to pale yellow ghosts, and the fire in her ribs cooled to a dull, manageable ache. She moved with a growing confidence, the sharp edges of her fear worn smooth by the profound and unwavering peace of the ranch. Her days were her own. She had claimed the kitchen in Grant's solid timber and stone house as her domain. It was a simple, functional space, but it was clean and well-stocked. And the large iron stove was a marvel of efficiency. She cooked for him. Simple, hearty meals that were the only form of communication that passed between them. She would leave a plate on the long wooden table in the main room. And later, the plate would be gone, washed clean and left by the sink. She rarely saw him. He was a phantom who kept the wood box filled and left fresh game or vegetables on the porch. He was the silent, steady presence that kept the world at bay. The silence of the house had become a comfort to her. It was a healing balm, a space where she could hear her own thoughts again, where the constant, grinding fear that had been her companion for so long had finally receded. She was not a prisoner. The doors were never locked. She was free to walk the valley, to feel the cold, clean wind on her face, to watch the hawks circle high against the cliffs. But the valley was a sanctuary. and she had no desire to leave. The need, when it came, was a practical one. The flour sack was nearly empty. The coffee beans were a handful of dust at the bottom of the tin. The salt was a few meager crystals. She made a list on a piece of scrap paper, the words stark and clear. They needed supplies, and supplies were in dead trace. The thought of the town was a cold knot in her stomach. To return to that place, to face the whispers and the hard, judging eyes, felt like stepping back into a nightmare. She could ask him to go. He was the master of this place. It was his right, his duty, but the thought of asking felt like a step backward, a return to the helpless woman he had found broken at the edge of a dying fire. Her mended skillet hung by the hearth, its dark iron absorbing the warmth of the flames. The silvery scar that ran through its center was a constant reminder. He had not seen her as a helpless thing to be pitied. He had seen her as a person with a craft, and he had restored her tool. To hide here forever would be to dishonor that silent act of respect. She left the list on the table beside his empty dinner plate. It was a test, for herself as much as for him. The next morning, when she entered the main room, the list was gone. In its place was a small, heavy leather pouch filled with coins and, sitting beside it, the keys to the supply shed. There was no note, no instructions. There was only trust. The horse he had chosen for her was a calm, steady mare, and the buckboard wagon was solid and well-maintained. As she guided the horse down the long, winding track that led out of the valley, Nora felt a tremor of her old fear. But it was different now. It was a cold, thin thing, not the all-consuming terror that had once ruled her. Beneath it was a new feeling, a quiet, hard-won resolve. She was no longer running, she was driving. The 2-hour journey passed in a blur of gray sage and brown earth. Dead Trace looked the same as she remembered it, a raw, ugly scar on the face of the prairie. But as she drove the wagon down the main street, she realized that while the town had not changed, she had, before, she had scurried through the street with her head down, trying to be invisible. Now, she sat tall on the wagon seat, her hands holding the reins with a steady grip, her gaze fixed straight ahead. Her arrival did not go unnoticed. The sight of Grant Rourke's sturdy wagon and horse, driven by the woman who had disappeared from the collar camp weeks ago, was enough to stop the town in its tracks. Men leaning against porch posts straightened up. Women sweeping their stoops paused, their brooms held motionless. The low hum of the town's daily life died away, replaced by a sudden, intense silence. Then came the whispers. They followed her like a cloud of insects as she pulled the wagon up in front of Henderson's Mercantile. She could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on her back as she climbed down. She did not hurry. Her movements were calm, deliberate. She looped the reins around the hitching post and turned to face the street. For a moment, she met the curious, hostile, and envious gazes of the townspeople. She did not smile. She did not scowl. She simply looked at them, her face calm, and then she turned and walked into the store. Mr. Henderson, a small, balding man with nervous eyes, was behind the counter. The last time she had been in his store, he had barely acknowledged her existence. Now, he was a flurry of anxious energy. "Mrs. Bellma'am, good to see you," he stammered, his eyes flicking from her to the wagon outside and back again. "What can I get for you today?" "Anything. We have a new shipment of everything." "I have a list," Nora said, her voice even. She placed the piece of paper on the counter. He snatched it up as if it were a royal decree. While he scurried around the store, gathering the items, other customers drifted in, their errands suddenly urgent. They did not speak to her, but they watched her, their whispers a low hiss in the crowded space. Rourke's woman. "Thought she was dead. Looks different, don't she, carries herself? Wonder what he sees in her." Nora ignored them. She stood by the counter, her back straight, and waited. She was no longer the frightened creature they remembered. The silence of White Ridge had settled deep inside her, a core of stillness that their petty judgments could not touch. She paid for the supplies with the coins from Rourke's pouch, and Henderson himself helped her carry the heavy sacks of flour and sugar out to the wagon. As she was arranging them in the back of the buckboard, a voice called her name. "Mrs. Bell." She turned. It was Reverend Miller, the town's preacher. He was a tall, thin man with a face full of earnest concern that did little to hide the judgment in his eyes. He wrung his hands as he approached her. "My child," he began, his voice oozing a pious sympathy. "We had all feared the worst for you. To see you now, it is a miracle. But I must, as your spiritual guide, express my concern." Nora waited, her expression unreadable. To be living out there, alone, with a man like Mr. Rourke. He lowered his voice. A man of his reputation, a man who does not attend services. It is a precarious position for a woman, for your immortal soul. People will talk. Your reputation will be— "My reputation," Nora interrupted, her voice quiet but firm, "was of no concern to the men who broke my ribs. Reverend, Mr. Rourke has been a kind and decent man to me." The preacher flushed, taken aback by her directness. Of course. But decency has its proper forms, its holy sacraments. Without the sanctity of marriage— "Thank you for your concern, Reverend," she said, cutting him off again. It was not a rude dismissal, but it was a final one. She turned back to her wagon. She had just finished securing the last of the sacks when a second, more familiar voice cut through the air, sharp and laced with scorn. Well, look what the cat dragged in." Nora's shoulders tensed. She turned slowly. Gemma Rue stood on the boardwalk in front of her saloon, her arms crossed, a cynical sneer on her face. The small crowd that had gathered to watch the preacher's failed sermon now turned their attention to this new spectacle. "I heard you'd found a new kennel," Gemma said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "So the lame deer found a wolf to protect her. He must be feeding you well. You've got some color back in your cheeks." Nora felt a flash of her old, hot shame. Her first instinct was to look away, to retreat, to make herself small. But then she felt the phantom weight of her mended skillet in her hand. She thought of the quiet respect in Grant Rourke's silent actions, and she stood her ground. She straightened her spine, pulling her shoulders back. She looked directly at Gemma Rue, her gaze steady and clear. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The quiet authority in her words was enough. "He did not beat me, Mrs. Rue," she said, her voice carrying across the silent street. "He did not leave me for dead." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. "And he mended my skillet." A flicker of surprise, of something like respect, crossed Gemma's hard face before she could hide it. The crowd murmured. These were simple, undeniable facts, and they were more powerful than any of the town's vicious rumors. Gemma's sneer returned, but it had lost some of its conviction. "So you're his property now? A prettier pot for his kitchen? Is that it?" This was the final test. This was the heart of it all. They could not see her as anything other than a possession, an object to be owned by one man or another. Nora took a step forward, away from the safety of the wagon. She stood alone in the dusty street, a singular, solid figure. The woman who had arrived in Dead Trace weeks ago was gone forever. In her place was someone new, someone forged in violence and healed in silence. "I don't belong to Mr. Rourke," she said, her voice ringing with a clarity that silenced the entire street. She met Gemma's gaze, and then her eyes swept over the faces of the watching crowd, meeting every stare without flinching. "I belong to myself." The silence that followed was absolute. No one knew what to say. Gemma Rue, for the first time since Nora had met her, looked completely speechless. She had expected fear or shame or defiance. She had not expected this quiet, unshakable dignity. Nora held their gazes for a moment longer. then turned her back on them all. She walked to the front of the wagon, climbed onto the seat with a steady, unhurried grace, and took up the reins. She did not look back. She clucked to the mare, and the wagon rolled forward, leaving the silent, stunned town of Dead Trace behind her. The journey back to White Ridge was quiet. The only sound, the creak of the wagon wheels and the steady tread of the horse. The fear was gone, burned away by the fire of her own self-respect. She was no longer a victim. She was Nora Bell, and she was going home. The peace that followed Nora's return from Dead Trace was a fragile, precious thing, like a thin pane of ice over a deep, still lake. The unspoken questions of the town, the whispers and the stares, did not follow her back up the winding track to White Ridge. Here, in the quiet valley, a new routine settled, one born not of necessity, but of a shared, unspoken understanding. She cooked, not just because it was her trade, but because it was her way of speaking. She learned the rhythms of the ranch through the appetites of the men who worked it. There were 3 others besides Grant Caleb, an old hand with eyes that had seen 70 winters and a face like a wrinkled leather map, and 2 younger men, Ben and Jesse, quiet and capable, who moved with the easy competence of those born to the saddle. For them. She made stews that simmered all day, thick with game and root vegetables. She baked bread that filled the stone and timber house with a scent of life and warmth. She learned that Caleb liked his coffee black and bitter, while the younger men took theirs with a spoonful of precious sugar. For Grant, she learned a different language. He ate what was put before him without comment, but she began to notice the small things. He would take a second helping of her apple pie, a rare treat made with dried apples she'd found in the pantry. He would linger over a cup of her strong coffee in the evening, sitting in his chair by the fire, the light playing over his rugged, unreadable face. These were his words of praise, and she learned to read them fluently. They existed in a state of respectful silence. He would leave a freshly dressed deer on the porch, and she would turn it into a week's worth of meals. She would leave a basket of mending by the fire, and in the morning, the torn shirts would be stitched with his own rough, strong thread. It was a partnership, a silent dance of provision and care. In this quiet world, she felt her own broken edges begin to knit together, much like her skillet. The scar was still there, a silvery line on the dark iron, but it was a mark of healing, not of breaking. The peace was shattered on a cold, clear afternoon. A lone rider appeared at the far end of the valley, a small, dark speck against the vast brown landscape. He did not ride like a lost traveler or a friendly neighbor. He rode with a sullen, purposeful slouch, his horse moving at a steady, menacing pace. Nora was outside, hanging laundry on a line stretched between 2 posts, the clean, cold wind whipping the wet fabric. She saw him first. Her hands froze on a clothespin, her heart giving a hard, painful lurch. Caleb, who was sharpening an axe on a grinding stone nearby, saw the direction of her gaze and slowly straightened up, his eyes narrowing. The rider did not approach the house. He stopped 100 yards out, where the wagon track met the open valley. He reached into his saddlebag, pulled out something small, and tied it to a fence post. Then, without a backward glance, he wheeled his horse around and rode away, swallowed up by the landscape as quickly as he had appeared. A profound, unnatural quiet descended. The wind seemed to die down. Caleb spat on the ground, a look of deep disgust on his face. He did not need to see what the rider had left. He knew. Grant emerged from the barn, his stride long and unhurried. He had seen it all. He walked past Nora, past Caleb, his eyes fixed on the distant fence post. He walked with a steady, deliberate pace, his boots crunching on the hard, cold earth. Nora watched him. Her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. The white sheets on the line flapped softly in the returning breeze, like surrender flags. He reached the post, untied the object, and stood for a long moment, looking at it, even from a distance. She could see the tension in his broad shoulders. Then he turned and walked back, his face a mask carved from stone. He did not show it to her, but she saw it as he passed. It was a dirty piece of canvas, torn from a sack. Scrawled on it in what looked like charcoal were a few crude, angry words. He walked into the house, and a moment later, she saw a flicker of orange in the hearth as he tossed it into the fire. The atmosphere of the ranch changed instantly. The quiet peace of the morning was gone, replaced by a tense, electric silence. The air itself felt different, thin and sharp, tasting of metal. It was the smell of a coming storm. It was the smell of war. Grant did not speak of the note. He did not need to. His actions were his words. He took a heavy wooden bar from the shed and began reinforcing the main door of the house. The sound of his hammer was a series of sharp, declarative bangs that echoed through the valley. Caleb and the younger men appeared as if summoned by the sound. They saw what Grant was doing, exchanged a single, hard look, and then went to their own tasks without a word of instruction. Ben climbed onto the roof of the house, his movements swift and sure, and began checking the shingles, ensuring there were no weak spots. Jesse went to the corral and began selecting the strongest, fastest horses, moving the others to a more sheltered pasture. Caleb disappeared into the small bunkhouse and returned with 3 rifles and several boxes of ammunition. He sat on the porch steps, a bottle of oil and a bundle of rags beside him, and began to meticulously clean each weapon. The slick metallic click-clack of the rifle bolts was a new, grim music. Nora stood frozen, a useless observer to the silent, efficient preparations for a battle she had brought to their door. These men, this quiet, decent man who had saved her, were preparing to fight, to bleed, to die, and it was because of her. The weight of her guilt was a physical thing, a stone in her chest that made it hard to breathe. She retreated to the kitchen, the one place she felt she had any control, but her hands trembled as she tried to chop vegetables. Her own mended skillet, hanging by the hearth, seemed to mock her, a tool for life, for nourishment, in a house that was preparing for death. The day bled into a long, tense evening. No one spoke of the reason for the preparations. They ate the supper she prepared in a heavy silence, the scrape of forks on plates unnaturally loud. After the meal, Grant laid the 3 freshly cleaned rifles on the long wooden table. He looked at Caleb, then at Ben and Jesse. "He's coming," Grant said. His voice was a low rumble. The first words he had spoken about the threat. It was a statement of absolute certainty. Caleb nodded, his wrinkled face grim. "We'll be ready." Ben and Jesse said nothing, but their jaws were set, their eyes steady. They were young, but there was no fear in their faces. There was only a quiet, resolute loyalty. They were staying. Nora looked at their faces, at their calm acceptance of the violence that was coming, and her guilt twisted into a sharp, unbearable agony. Later that night, when the others had retired to the bunkhouse to get what sleep they could, Nora found Grant standing by the window in the main room, a dark silhouette against the moonlit landscape. The house was silent, save for the crackling of the fire. She walked toward him, her footsteps soft on the wooden floor. She stopped a few feet behind him. "I should leave," she whispered, her voice tight with unshed tears. "In the morning, before they come, if I'm gone, they'll have no reason." He turned slowly to face her. In the dim firelight, she could see the hard lines of his face, the deep-set eyes that seemed to hold the weight of the world. "They'll come anyway," he said, his voice flat. "This isn't just about you anymore. Collar wants this land. He wants what happened to his cousins avenged. You were just the excuse he needed." "But I was the excuse," she insisted, her voice breaking. "I brought this to you. To this place. To those boys in the bunkhouse." She took a ragged breath, the words tumbling out in a rush of guilt and despair. "If I stay, if there is a fight, they will die because of me." She stood before him, exposed and broken, offering to sacrifice herself to undo the damage she had caused. She expected him to agree, to nod his solemn acceptance. It was the only logical, sensible thing to do. But Grant Rourke did not move. He simply looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes beyond the stillness and the solitude. It was a fierce, protective light, a deep and unwavering fire. He took a step closer, and for the first time, he spoke to her. Not in single words or short, factual statements, but in a voice that was a low, resonant rumble, a voice that held the conviction of a lifetime of silence. "Before you came here, Nora," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "This was just a place of stone and wood. It was a fortress, a place to keep the world out. We worked, we ate, we slept. We were alive, but we weren't living." He gestured around the quiet, firelit room. "You came, and you brought this." He struggled for the word. "The smell of bread, the fire always lit, a mended shirt. You brought life into this house. You gave us something to come home to, not just a place to sleep. You reminded us that there is more to this world than just surviving." He looked directly into her eyes, and the force of his gaze held her motionless. "So, no," he said, his voice dropping, becoming softer, but more intense than any shout. "We will not die because of you." He paused, and the words he spoke next landed in the quiet room with the weight of absolute truth. "We live because of you, and we will defend this life. Together." The simple, profound power of his words stripped the breath from her lungs. He had taken her guilt and transformed it. He had taken her shame and turned it into a banner. She was not the cause of this fight. She was the reason for it. She was the life they had chosen to defend. Tears finally spilled from her eyes. But they were not tears of sorrow or of fear. They were tears of a deep, soul-shaking gratitude. In that moment, the last of the broken pieces inside her settled into place. She was no longer a victim, a drifter, or a burden. She was a part of this house, this land, this small, defiant family. She belonged, and she would not run. They did not have to wait long. The attack came in the thin, gray light that is not quite dawn, the moment when the world is drained of color and held in a state of suspended silence. Nora had been awake for hours, her body humming with a nervous energy that made sleep impossible. She had built up the fire in the kitchen stove, its warmth a small, defiant pocket of life against the bone-deep chill that had settled over the house. The coffee was brewing, its rich, dark scent a fragile, ordinary perfume in a house that smelled of gun oil and grim anticipation. Grant and the others had taken their positions before the first hint of light, moving with a quiet, practiced economy that spoke of a deep and sorrowful knowledge of violence. Grant stood by the main window in the great room, his large frame a dark, unmoving silhouette. Caleb was at the smaller window overlooking the barn, a long rifle resting on the sill. Ben and Jesse were mobile, moving silently between the other vantage points, their faces pale but set in the dim light. Nora's job was to be the heart of the fortress. She kept the coffee pot full, bringing hot, black coffee to the men in turn. They would take the mugs with a nod, their eyes never leaving the graying landscape outside. She had also been tasked with reloading. Grant had spent a half hour with her the night before, his large, patient hands showing her the simple, mechanical process of refilling the empty cartridges. Her hands, so used to the feel of dough and the weight of a knife, now learned the cold, precise geometry of lead and brass. It was a grim, terrible skill, and she learned it quickly. The first shot was a sharp, flat crack that shattered the pre-dawn stillness. It was followed an instant later by the sound of splintering wood as the bullet punched through the wall near the main window. A mug of coffee in Jesse's hand exploded, spraying his shirt with dark, hot liquid. He didn't flinch. He simply dropped the broken ceramic and picked up his rifle. And then the world erupted. A volley of shots rang out from the rocks and scrub at the edge of the valley. Bullets thudded into the thick timber walls of the house, chewed at the window frames, and whined through the air. The sound was a deafening, continuous roar, a hailstorm of lead and noise. The air in the room grew thick and acrid with the smell of gunpowder. Inside the house, there was no panic. Grant's voice cut through the din. Not a shout, but a low, clear command. Caleb, the two by the ridge. Jesse, the wagon. Ben, with me. Their response was immediate and devastatingly effective. Grant's heavy rifle boomed, a deep, authoritative voice in the chorus of chaos. A man who had been foolish enough to stand up from behind a rock outcropping simply ceased to be there. Caleb's shot was a quieter crack, and a puff of dust rose from another position. Ben and Jesse fired in a steady, disciplined rhythm, their shots pinning down the men who were trying to advance on the house. Nora's fear was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but there was no time for it. She was a part of this now, a cog in this terrible machine. She worked at the small table she had set up behind the stone hearth, her hands moving automatically. Empty casings were discarded. New powder and lead were pressed into place. Her movements were swift. Sure, she was a cook, used to working under pressure, used to the precise alchemy of turning simple ingredients into a finished product. The ingredients were different now, but the focus was the same. The initial, furious assault faltered under the steady, accurate fire from the house. The attackers were not soldiers. They were a gang, fueled by whiskey and a desire for easy vengeance. They had expected to surprise a sleeping ranch, to overwhelm it with sheer noise and violence. They had not expected a fortress. They had not expected Grant Rourke. The fight settled into a grim, deadly rhythm. A fusillade of shots from the rocks, answered by the methodical, measured fire from the house. Splinters of wood flew through the air. A bullet shattered a pane of glass in the kitchen window, and Nora flinched as the cold morning air rushed in. She risked a glance out the main window. The yard was a chaotic scene of swirling dust and gun smoke. She saw a horse go down, screaming. She saw a man crawling for the cover of a watering trough, his leg dragging uselessly behind him. The violence was not glorious or heroic. It was ugly, clumsy, and brutal. It was the sound of men trying to tear each other apart. Jed Collar's voice rose in a furious shout from the cover of the rocks. "Burn them out! Get to the house!" Two men broke from cover, running low, trying to reach the blind spot on the side of the house where the kitchen was. Ben and Jesse's rifles cracked simultaneously. One of the men spun around and fell. The other stumbled, but kept coming. It was then that Nora saw the new, immediate threat. While the men's attention was on the main yard, a single attacker had managed to crawl up to the house, to the kitchen window that had been shattered. He was a big, bearded man, his face a mask of grime and fury. He used the butt of his rifle to smash out the rest of the glass and began to haul himself over the sill. He was focused on the main room, on the backs of Grant and the others. He did not see her. He did not see the small, quiet woman standing in the shadows by the hearth. For a heartbeat, Nora was frozen. The sight of this man, this embodiment of the violence that had broken her, invading her sanctuary, sent a wave of pure, cold terror through her. But then her eyes fell on her skillet, hanging on its hook by the fire. Her skillet, the one he had mended, the symbol of her own healing, the last gift from her husband, the tool of her trade. Thought did not enter into it. It was pure, primal instinct. She was not a victim to be cornered. This was her kitchen. This was her home. She grabbed the skillet, its weight familiar and solid in her hand. The man had just gotten his legs inside the house. He was turning, raising his rifle. She moved, not with the grace of a fighter, but with the desperate, focused energy of a mother defending her young. She swung the heavy cast-iron pan in a flat, horizontal arc, putting all of her weight, all of her fear, and all of her rage into the blow. The sound was not the sharp crack of a rifle. It was a low, solid, sickening thud of iron on bone. The skillet connected with the side of the man's head. His eyes went wide with a kind of stupid surprise. The rifle clattered from his hands, and then he simply folded, collapsing onto the floor in a boneless heap. Nora stood over him, panting, the skillet held in a two-handed grip. The room was suddenly, shockingly silent. The firing outside had seemed to falter. Through the broken window, she saw Jed Collar, his face a mask of disbelief, staring at the scene inside the kitchen. He had seen it. He had seen his man, his instrument of terror, felled by a cook with a frying pan. The sight of his own man being taken down from within, and by the very woman he had come to reclaim, seemed to break something in him. The furious momentum of the attack was gone. He shouted a string of curses, then a single, sharp command: "Fall back." The retreat was as chaotic and ugly as the attack. The surviving members of Collar's gang scrambled from their cover, firing blindly as they ran for their horses. They were no longer an attacking force. They were a routed mob, desperate to escape. Caleb and the others did not let up. Their fire was cool and methodical, punishing the fleeing men for their arrogance. And then, as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The last of the riders disappeared over the ridge, leaving behind a profound, ringing silence. The yard was littered with the evidence of their failure: a dead horse, dark stains on the ground, and the still form of the man Ben and Jesse had shot. The air was heavy with the metallic tang of gunpowder and the smell of churned-up, dusty earth. Inside the house, no one moved for a long moment. The adrenaline that had sustained them began to drain away, leaving a bone-deep weariness in its place. Ben leaned his forehead against the wall, his chest heaving. Caleb slowly, deliberately, lowered the hammer on his rifle. Nora's arms were trembling. The skillet suddenly felt impossibly heavy. She let it drop. It landed on the wooden floor with a soft thud. She looked from the unconscious man at her feet to Grant. He was turning from the window, his face grim. He looked at the man on the floor, then at her. His eyes held a question, a deep and profound concern. And then she saw it. A dark, wet stain was spreading across the sleeve of his left shoulder. "You're hurt," she whispered, the words barely audible. He glanced down at his arm, as if noticing it for the first time. "It's a graze." The sight of his blood, of his injury, broke the spell that had held her. She crossed the room in 3 quick strides, her fear for him eclipsing everything else. She reached him and, without thinking, her hands went to his arm, her fingers probing the torn fabric, checking the wound. It was a long, shallow gash, bleeding freely but not deeply. It was not a mortal wound, but it was a wound taken in defense of this house, in defense of her. Her examination finished. She did not step back. The need to touch him, to reassure herself that he was solid and alive, was an overwhelming, physical force. She pressed her face against his chest, her arms wrapping around his solid waist. She was not seeking comfort from a protector. She was not a frightened woman running into the arms of a savior. It was a different kind of embrace entirely. It was a conscious, deliberate act. It was the act of a woman who had finally, unequivocally, chosen her ground. She was holding on to the one solid thing in her world. She was holding what was hers. The embrace was a moment of stillness in the heart of the storm's aftermath. For a long, silent beat, the world consisted only of the solid wall of his chest, the slow, steady beat of his heart under her ear, and the comforting, solid strength of his arms. It was an anchor in a world that had just been torn apart by noise and violence. Then, slowly, as if waking from a dream, the sounds of the world returned. The low moan of the wind through the broken window pane, the distant, nervous whinny of a horse, the soft groan from the man on the floor. Grant's arms loosened, but he did not step away immediately. He placed one large hand on her shoulder, a gesture that was both grounding and a gentle release. His eyes, when she looked up at him, were dark with 100 unspoken emotions. But the one that stood out was a deep, quiet gratitude. He looked at her not as a woman he had saved, but as a partner who had stood her ground. The work began then, a grim and necessary litany of tasks to reclaim their home from the violation of the attack. There was no discussion, no assignment of roles. Each of them simply saw what needed to be done and did it. Nora. Grant's voice was a low rumble, and it was a command, but one born of concern, not authority. He nodded toward his bleeding arm. She understood. The fear and adrenaline that had powered her through the fight receded, replaced by a sharp, clear focus. This was a task she knew. A wound was a problem to be solved, like a difficult cut of meat or a fire that wouldn't draw. She went to the kitchen pump, her hands steady now, and worked the handle. The gush of cold. Clean water, a restorative sound. She found clean cloths in a chest, tore them into strips, and brought the basin to the main table. He sat, and for the first time, she saw the weariness in him. He had been a pillar of strength throughout the ordeal, but now, with the danger past, the immense weight he carried was visible in the slump of his shoulders. He shrugged out of his torn and bloody shirt, and she drew a sharp breath. His shoulder and chest were a landscape of old scars, pale white lines against his sun-darkened skin. A silent history of a hard and violent life. This new wound was just another chapter in that book. Her touch was gentle but firm as she cleaned the gash. Her fingers, accustomed to the delicate work of kneading dough and measuring spices, were now tracing the edges of a bullet wound, washing away his blood. He sat perfectly still under her care, his breathing slow and even. He did not flinch when the water stung the raw flesh. He simply watched her, his gaze intense, and in that silent, intimate moment, a new and unbreakable bond was forged between them. She was not just the cook he had taken in. She was the woman who was tending his wounds, and he was not just the silent rancher who had saved her. He was the man who had bled for her. While she worked, the others dealt with the rest of the grim accounting. Caleb and Ben dragged the unconscious man from the kitchen, his head lolling, and tied him securely in the tool shed. Jesse took a shovel and went out into the yard. Nora did not watch him, but she heard the rhythmic scrape and thud of his work, and she knew he was erasing the ugliest scars of the morning, covering the blood with fresh earth. Later, Grant rose, his shoulder now tightly bound with a clean white bandage. He put on a fresh shirt, the fabric stark against his skin. He looked toward the shed. "I'll take him into town," he said to Caleb. "Sheriff can have what's left of him." Then his eyes went to the body of the man Ben and Jesse had shot, still lying in the yard. His face hardened. "The other one is ours. He won't be buried in town ground." The task of burying the dead attacker was a somber, silent affair. Grant and Caleb carried the body to a far corner of the valley, to a small, unmarked patch of ground beneath the shadow of the great white cliffs. Nora watched from the porch as they worked, two dark figures digging into the hard, unforgiving earth. There was no ceremony, no prayer. It was simply the final, necessary act of cleaning up. They were returning a piece of the world's violence back to the dirt. By the time they returned, the sun was high and the day, impossibly, looked beautiful and ordinary. The air was clean and cold, the sky a piercing, cloudless blue. But the house bore the scars of the morning's work. The walls were pockmarked with bullet holes. The main window was shattered. The floor was tracked with mud and something darker. Nora set to work. She swept up the broken glass, her hands careful around the sharp edges. She scrubbed the floor, erasing the last traces of the intruder. She patched the bullet holes with a mixture of mud and straw, a temporary fix against the coming cold. With each act of cleaning, of mending, she was reclaiming her space, pushing out the memory of the violence with the quiet, determined work of her own two hands. They ate their supper that night in a profound and different kind of silence. It was not the tense, watchful silence of the days before, nor the awkward, uncertain silence of her first arrival. It was a deep, shared weariness, the quiet of soldiers after a battle. They were 4 men and 1 woman who had faced death together and survived. Words were unnecessary. The shared bread, the passed salt, the quiet nods, these were their communion. After the meal, Ben and Jesse took out a deck of worn cards and began to play a quiet game of whist. Caleb sat on the porch, smoking his pipe and staring out at the star-dusted valley. Grant sat in his usual chair by the fire, watching the flames, his bandaged shoulder a stark white patch in the dim light. Nora sat in the chair opposite him, a basket of mending in her lap, her needle and thread moving in a steady, rhythmic dance. They did not speak. They did not need to. The simple fact of their presence in this room, safe and whole, was the only conversation that mattered. The storm had come. It had thrown its worst at them, and the house had held. The roots had held. The light that came the next morning was different. It was not the thin, gray, menacing light of the day before. It was a soft, golden light that poured into the valley, silvering the tips of the frost-covered grass and washing the world clean. It streamed through the windows of the house, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, making the familiar room seem new again. Nora was in the kitchen. She moved with a quiet, purposeful grace, her body aching but her spirit calm. She sifted flour into a large wooden bowl, the white powder a soft, clean cloud. She added water, salt, yeast, and then she began to knead the dough. Her hands, which had been clenched in fear, which had trembled as she loaded cartridges, which had held a skillet as a weapon, were steady now. The rhythm was familiar, comforting. Push, fold, turn, push, fold, turn. It was a rhythm of life, of creation. With each movement, she was working the memory of the violence out of her own muscles, transforming the simple ingredients of flour and water into a promise of nourishment, of normalcy. Grant came in as she was shaping the loaves. He moved quietly, stopping in the doorway to watch her. He had come from the barn, and he smelled of hay and horses and the cold morning air. His shirt was torn where she had cut away the fabric to dress his wound, but his face, for the first time since she had met him, was completely at peace. The harsh, watchful lines around his eyes had softened. The grim set of his jaw had relaxed. He walked to the long wooden table and sat down, not in his usual place at the head, but closer to where she was working. He did not speak. He simply sat, nursing a mug of coffee, and watched her. He watched the sure, steady movement of her hands. He watched as she slid the loaves into the hot oven. He watched as she began to clean the flour from the countertop. She was aware of his gaze, but it was not the assessing, measuring gaze of the men in Dead Trace. It was a quiet, steady presence that was as comforting as the warmth from the stove. The silence between them was no longer an empty space to be filled, but a shared and precious thing. It was the silence of 2 people who had seen the worst of each other's worlds and had chosen to stay. Soon, the house began to fill with the rich, warm, life-affirming scent of baking bread. It was a smell that spoke of home, of sustenance, of a future. It pushed out the last lingering, acrid ghost of gunpowder and filled the house with peace. Nora took a clean cloth and wiped her hands. She turned and looked at him, truly looked at him, sitting at the table in her kitchen, his torn shirt a badge of honor, his face calm in the golden morning light. He looked back at her, and his eyes held everything he could not say. They had chosen each other. Not with vows or promises spoken in the light of day. They had chosen each other in the darkness, in the face of fear and violence. He had chosen her when he lifted her broken body from the cold ground. She had chosen him when she had swung a skillet to defend his home, and they had both chosen this life, this quiet and simple peace. When they had refused to run, they had stayed, and in the staying, they had found their home. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please leave a comment below to connect with us and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like, and consider hitting the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.